Throughout history, ordinary people, soldiers, and even fathers have crossed an invisible line where pain turned into something far more dangerous. What followed were deaths so brutal, so calculated, that the world still talks about them decades later. These are not movie plots. These are real moments when revenge overpowered reason and blood became the final answer. The village of Kamo was the kind of place where everyone knew the sound of everyone else's footsteps. Doors were rarely locked. Neighbors borrowed rice without asking. At night, the only noise was the wind moving through cedar trees. That illusion of safety ended just before dawn on May 21st, 1938. What happened in those dark hours would become known as the Tsuyama massacre, one of the most brutal acts of personal revenge ever recorded. And at the center of it was a 21-year-old man named Mutsuo Toi, a quiet farmer's son who had spent years sinking into bitterness, illness, and humiliation. Toi had not always been feared. As a child, he was described as intelligent, even gentle. But tuberculosis, an illness that carried enormous stigma in pre-war Japan, changed everything. The disease weakened his body and, in the eyes of the village, stained his future. Families who once greeted him warmly began to keep their distance. In a community built on reputation and marriage prospects, Toi became an outsider. Rumors spread that women avoided him, that neighbors whispered behind sliding doors. He wrote obsessively in notebooks about rejection, about being mocked, about how the village had decided his worth without trial. Those writings, discovered later, read less like diaries and more like indictments. Somewhere in that isolation, resentment hardened into something darker. Months before the massacre, strange things began to happen. Toi sold belongings, borrowed tools, and practiced moving through the hills at night. He studied the layout of homes, memorizing which families slept where. No one understood the pattern, only that the young man had become increasingly withdrawn. On the evening before the attack, the electricity to the village was deliberately cut. Darkness swallowed Kamo completely, leaving only moonlight and the faint glow of oil lamps. It was the perfect cover. Toi left his house dressed in black, his face wrapped in a headband like a soldier preparing for battle. He carried weapons gathered from years of planning. What he also carried, according to the notes found later, was a belief that he had been pushed to this moment by everyone around him. The first house was only a few steps away, then another, and another. Survivors would later describe hearing knocks at doors, familiar voices calling out, followed by sounds that did not belong in a peaceful farming village. Entire families were attacked before they fully understood who stood in their rooms. Toi moved with a chilling purpose from home to home, targeting people he believed had humiliated or rejected him. Some victims were neighbors he had known since childhood. Others were simply in the wrong place when he arrived. Even his grandmother, the woman who had raised him, was not spared. By the time the sun began to rise, 29 people were dead, and several more lay wounded. Kamo, once a quiet cluster of wooden houses, had become a landscape of shock and disbelief. As villagers fled into the fields, and authorities struggled to comprehend what was happening, Toi climbed into the surrounding hills. There, overlooking the community he felt had destroyed him, he ended his own life. Police later discovered detailed writings in his home, pages filled with anger towards specific individuals, lists of grievances, and chilling reflections on how revenge would restore his dignity. They were not the ramblings of madness alone, but the twisted logic of a man who believed he had been sentenced by society long before he picked up a weapon. The Tsuyama massacre shocked Japan in a way few crimes had. It forced a nation to confront uncomfortable questions. How much can rejection deform a human mind? How invisible can suffering become in small, close communities? And how did no one see the storm gathering in one lonely young man? Kamo was rebuilt. Houses were repaired. Families tried to continue. But the silence of that village was never the same. Even today, the event lingers in Japanese memory as a warning about isolation, stigma, and the terrifying direction revenge can take when it is allowed to grow unchecked in the dark.
The claim came for peacekeeping, but later diverted from the role they came to play and almost destroyed the whole of General Malu's house and other places.
The first report sounded unbelievable. In the dusty farming towns of Benue State, people began whispering that soldiers were coming, not to protect, not to patrol, but to punish. No one knew how far that punishment would go. By the time the rumors hardened into reality, it was already too late. What unfolded in October 2001 would become known as the Zaki-Biam massacre, one of the darkest episodes in Nigeria's modern history. A campaign of revenge carried out not by criminals or militants, but by the very army sworn to defend its citizens. Days earlier, 19 Nigerian soldiers had disappeared while on a mission in Tiv territory. When their bodies were later discovered, mutilated and dumped, the military command concluded that local militias were responsible. Anger swept through the barracks. Radio chatter spoke of vengeance, of teaching the Tiv people a lesson they would never forget. But there was no investigation, no arrests, no attempt to separate the guilty from the innocent. Instead, entire communities were marked as targets. Witnesses remember the sound before they remember the sight, the heavy grind of military trucks, the thud of helicopter blades cutting the hot afternoon air. Soldiers arrived in long convoys, faces hidden behind dark glasses and helmets, weapons already raised. In villages like Zaki-Biam, Gbeji, Vase, Anyin, and Kiado, people were ordered out of their homes. Some thought it was another routine security operation. Others sensed something far worse. Then the shooting began. Houses were set ablaze one after another. Markets, where women sold yams and peppers, became killing grounds. Elderly men who could barely walk were accused of harboring militants. Children ran toward the bush as bullets chased them. Survivors later said the soldiers did not ask questions. They did not search for specific suspects. They treated the entire population as the enemy. Over several days, the operation spread like a storm across Benue. Heavy machine guns, grenades, and armored vehicles were used against communities that had no means of defense. Churches and clinics, places normally considered sanctuaries, were not spared. By the time the troops withdrew, more than 200 civilians were believed to be dead. Some local groups insisted the real number was far higher. Bodies were buried in hurried mass graves, others were never found at all. The official explanation was simple: retaliation for murdered soldiers. But the victims were farmers, traders, schoolchildren, people with no connection to the original crime. Revenge had become policy. When journalists finally reached the area, they found towns that looked abandoned by history. Burnt roofs sagged toward the earth. Dogs wandered through empty compounds. The smell of smoke still clung to the walls weeks later. The federal government issued an apology and promised investigations. Committees were formed, statements were made, compensation was discussed. Yet no commander was ever convicted. No soldier ever stood in a civilian court. For many families, the massacre became a wound with no courtroom, no verdict, and no grave they could visit with certainty. More than 2 decades later, the Zaki-Biam massacre remains wrapped in suspicion. Who gave the order to treat entire villages as combatants? Why were negotiations never attempted? How did a professional army slide so quickly from security operation to collective punishment? In Benue, elders say the real tragedy was not only the deaths, but the message left behind. That in moments of anger, power can erase the line between justice and slaughter. The roads are busy again now. Markets have reopened. Children born after 2001 walk past rebuilt houses without knowing what once stood there. But those who survived still lower their voices when helicopters pass overhead.
The Iga-Ueno vendetta is a captivating tale of honor, revenge, and the complex social codes of the Edo period in Japan. Set in the town of Iga-Ueno, the incident unfolded in 1634, a time of relative peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. The vendetta is known as one of the 3 major Adauchi vendetta incidents in Japan.
Long before modern penal systems existed, Japan's code of honor allowed and even legalized revenge under strict conditions. Known in Japanese as keitakuchi, this sanctioned retaliation was both a duty and a ritual for samurai whose relatives were murdered. when justice from authorities failed to answer personal loss. Many samurai believed there was only one way to restore honor: revenge with steel in hand. One of the most infamous cases of such vendetta took place on November 7, 1634, in the town of Iga-Ueno, involving Watanabe Kazuma and the man he held responsible for his brother's death. In 1630, Watanabe Kazuma's brother, Watanabe Gendeyu, was murdered by Kawai Matagoro, a man who killed his friend out of jealousy and fled justice. Formal attempts to capture Matagoro failed, and when the local authorities proved unable to legally punish the killer, Kazuma and his brother-in-law, Araki Matemon, took matters into their own hands. Within samurai culture, revenge was not merely a personal act of vengeance. It was a social expectation, deeply rooted in katakyuchi, a ritual of retaliation that carried strict rules and required official permission from local magistrates. Under this code, a samurai seeking revenge had to register his intent, carry out the act in broad daylight, and face the consequences in front of witnesses. Otherwise, the deed became nothing less than murder. Kazuma and Matemon tracked Matagoro to Igago Pass near Iga-Ueno, where they confronted him in broad daylight, obedient to both the spirit and the letter of katakyuchi. In the ensuing clash, they killed Matagoro along with several of his retainers. The showdown was swift and dramatic, fulfilling the samurai's lifelong promise to avenge a murdered brother. Unlike many unauthorized revenge killings of the era, this vendetta was carried out within the accepted customs of the time. Because Kazuma had acted under the traditional katakyuchi code, with intention, public visibility, and at a direct invitation to settle the blood debt, the act was considered honorable by many contemporaries, even as it remained an unmistakable act of violence. The Igego vendetta stands alongside other legendary acts of samurai revenge in Japanese history because it illustrates the complex intersection of law, honor, and personal justice. In a society where external legal systems were emerging but cultural expectations remained rooted in ancient codes, Kazuma's choice shows just how far a person could go to right a wrong not through judges or courts, but through steel and blood. It remains a reminder that in some eras and cultures, justice was not defined by rules in ink, but by the weight of a sword and the promise of a warrior.
But he changed his mind when he saw how angry Kudo's young son was, and he realized that if he didn't punish Goro, then the cycle of revenge would continue and there would be no peace.
Long before detectives, courtrooms, or written laws of evidence, Japan was ruled by something older and heavier than justice: honor. A man's worth was measured by loyalty to his bloodline, and an unpaid insult could echo across generations. The story of the Soga brothers Tsukanari and Tokimune began not with swords in their hands, but with the murder of their father, Kawazu Sukeyasu, killed during a dispute among samurai clans. The man responsible was Kudo Suketsune, a powerful warrior protected by status and allies. To the boys, he was not just an enemy, he was the thief of their future. From childhood, they were raised on a single idea: the debt must one day be settled. The brothers did not speak openly of revenge, yet everyone around them understood. In feudal society, avenging a father was not madness, it was duty. Monks, relatives, even mentors reminded them that a son who ignored such a crime would live as half a man. Years passed. They trained with the bow and the sword. They learned patience, the most dangerous weapon of all. Suketsune, meanwhile, rose higher in the ranks, believing the past had faded. He could not have known that two boys were quietly shaping their entire lives around the moment they would meet him again. That moment arrived on June 28, 1193, during the Grand Fuji no Makigari hunting event hosted by Shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo. Hundreds of warriors filled the camps at the foot of Mount Fuji, fires burning, horses restless, sake flowing. Amid the celebration, the Soga brothers moved like shadows. They waited until darkness softened the vigilance of guards. Then, slipping through the maze of tents, they found Kudo Suketsune asleep. The strike was swift and decisive. With that single act, decades of anger were released. But revenge is rarely neat. The alarm spread instantly. Samurai rushed from every direction, and in the chaos several more men were cut down. What was meant to be a private settling of blood turned into a battlefield of confusion. Tsukanari, the elder, fell during the fighting, surrounded by warriors loyal to Suketsune. Tokimun fought on, cutting a path through the camp until he was finally captured and brought before the shogun himself. The chronicles describe a tense silence as the young avenger stood in chains. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, he declared that he had fulfilled the sacred duty of a son. Yoritomo ordered his execution. With that, the Soga line effectively ended, but their names were only beginning to live. What might have been remembered as simple murder was transformed by storytellers into one of Japan's greatest epics. Plays, poems, and later kabuki dramas portrayed the brothers as tragic heroes, symbols of unwavering filial loyalty. Yet beneath the romance lies a darker question. Were they noble sons restoring balance, or young men taught that blood was the only language of justice? The tale survives because it sits uncomfortably between those two truths. More than 800 years later, the revenge of the Soga brothers is still taught, debated, and performed. It shaped the Japanese idea of katakyuchi, vendetta carried out in the name of family duty, and influenced how generations understood the thin line between righteousness and violence. The hunting fields of Fuji are peaceful now. Tourists walk where armored men once ran with drawn blades. But the story remains a reminder that long before laws decided guilt, the heart of revenge beat to a far older rhythm. And once that rhythm begins, history shows how difficult it is to stop. The camera was already rolling. It was meant to capture something routine. Police escorting a prisoner through Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport. Reporters expected a few seconds of ordinary footage. Handcuffs, a lowered head, another criminal heading toward justice. Instead, the nation watched a father step out of the crowd and change everything in a single motion. Weeks earlier, 11-year-old Jeffrey Jody Plauche had vanished from his neighborhood. The man responsible was Jeff Duce, a karate instructor and family acquaintance who had gained the boy's trust over time. What followed was a nightmare of kidnapping and abuse that stretched across state lines before authorities finally located them in California. When Jody was rescued, the truth came out in fragments, too painful for headlines, yet impossible to hide. The Plauche family learned what had been done to their child, and with that knowledge came a rage no courtroom could easily contain. Gary Plauche, Jody's father, spoke little in public. Friends later said he seemed calm on the surface, but inside he was unraveling, torn between relief that his son was alive and fury at the man who had stolen his innocence. On March 16, 1984, Duce was flown back to Louisiana to face charges. Television crews gathered in the airport corridor, waiting to film the transfer. Officers walked the prisoner forward, hands cuffed behind his back, unaware that someone else was waiting too. Gary Plauche stood by a payphone, baseball cap pulled low, pretending to make a call. The camera caught everything: the casual posture, the sudden turn, the flash of movement. One shot, a brief echo against the tile walls. Doucet collapsed to the floor as stunned officers wrestled the gun from the father's hand. Viewers at home saw it unfold in real time, unedited, before broadcasters even understood what they were airing. In that instant, the line between victim and criminal blurred for millions of Americans. The killing ignited an argument that has never truly ended. Some called Gary Plauche a murderer who undermined the rule of law. Others saw a desperate father doing what the system could never fully do, protecting his child and preventing future harm. Letters poured into newspapers praising him as a hero. Talk shows debated whether any parent in his position would have acted differently. In court, the legal outcome reflected that tension. Plauche faced serious charges, yet the sentence was unexpectedly light: probation, community service, and a suspended term. The judge cited extreme emotional disturbance. Many believed the unspoken verdict had already been delivered by public opinion. Lost beneath the headlines was the quiet reality that followed. Jody Plauche still had to grow up carrying trauma that no single bullet could erase. Gary had to live not only with what Duce had done, but with what he himself had chosen to do in response. Years later, father and son spoke publicly about healing, forgiveness, and the complicated truth that revenge rarely feels like victory once the adrenaline fades. The video remains one of the most replayed moments in American crime history. Not because it is sensational, but because it forces a question with no comfortable answer. When justice fails a child, does a father become a criminal or something far more tragic? The Plauche case reshaped conversations about vigilantism, victims' rights, and the limits of the legal system. Law schools still analyze it. Psychologists still debate the breaking point of parental instinct. The footage, grainy and brief, continues to circulate as a mirror held up to society's conflicting beliefs about punishment and mercy. What happened in that airport corridor lasted only seconds. The argument it created has lasted decades.